மாண்புமிகு முதல்வர் முன்னிட்ட ஆன்றோர்கள் சான்றோர்கள் அடங்கிய இந்த அவையில் அனைவருக்கும் எங்களுடைய பணிவான காலை வணக்கம். நீதி மற்றும் சமத்துவத்திற்கான ராகேஷ் அறக்கட்டளை தொடர் சொற்பொழியின் முதல் அரங்கமாக ரோஜா முத்தையா ஆராய்ச்சி நூலகத்தின் சார்பாக நடைபெறும் இந்த விழாவிற்கு வருகை தந்துள்ள உங்கள் அனைவரையும் வரவேற்கின்றோம். Good morning to you all. I welcome one and all on the occasion of the first Rakesh Memorial Endowment Lecture for Justice and Equity being conducted on behalf of the Roja Muthiah Research Library. இந்த நிகழ்வு தமிழ் தாய் வாழ்த்துடன் ஆரம்பமாகிறது. அனைவரையும் எழுந்து நிற்பார் கேட்கின்றோம். செல்வி சௌந்தர்யா அவர்களை தமிழ் தாய் வாழ்த்து பாட அழைக்கின்றேன்.
நீராறும் கடலுடுத்த நிலமடந்தை கெழிலொழுகும் சீராரும் வதனமென திகழ்பரத கண்டமிதில் தெக்கணமும் அதில் சிறந்த திராவிடனல் திருநாடும் தக்க சிறு பிறை நுதலும் தரித்தனரும் திலகமுமே அத்திலக வாசனை போல் அனைத்துலகும் இன்பமுற எத்திசையும் புகழ் மணக்க இருந்த பெரும் தமிழனங்கே தமிழனங்கே உன் சீரிழமை திறன் வியந்து செயல் மறந்து வாழ்த்ததுமே வாழ்த்ததுமே வாழ்த்ததுமே.
நிகழ்வுக்கு முன்பாக வந்திருக்கக்கூடிய விருந்தினர்களை நாங்கள் கௌரவிக்க விரும்புகின்றோம். என்ஆர் இளங்கோ அவர்கள் மாண்புமிகு முதல்வர் அவர்களுக்கு சால்வை அணிவித்து புத்தகத்தை பரிசாக அளிப்பார்கள். அதனைத் தொடர்ந்து ரோஜா முத்தையா ஆராய்ச்சி நூலகத்தின் இயக்குனர் சுந்தர் அவர்கள் திரு கபில் சிபல் அவர்களுக்கு சால்வை அணிவித்து புத்தகத்தை பரிசாக அளிக்கும்படி கேட்டுக்கொள்கின்றேன். அவர்களே திரு என் ராம் அவர்களுக்கும் சால்வை அணிவித்து புத்தகத்தை பரிசாக அளிக்கும்படி கேட்டுக்கொள்கின்றோம். சுந்தர் அவர்களை வேதநிதி ஸ்டாலின் அவர்களுக்கு சால்வை அணிவித்து புத்தகத்தை அளிக்கும்படி கேட்டுக்கொள்கின்றோம். Now our chief guest, today's speaker, will present a book, The Shades of Truth, to the Honorable Chief Minister on his behalf. He wishes to give the book, sir. ஐயன் வள்ளுவன் சொல்வான், நெருநல் உளனொருவன் இன்றில்லை என்னும் பெருமையுடைத்து இவ்வுலகு. Sir, our greatest poet Thiru said, the world possesses an arrogant pride. I emphasize an arrogant pride. That one who yesterday was is not today. வள்ளுவனின் இந்த குரலுக்கு பரிமேல் அழகர் முதல் சாலமன் பாப்பையா வரை உரை எழுதியிருக்கிறார்கள். ஆனால் முத்தமிழறிஞர் டாக்டர் கலைஞர் அவர்கள் எழுதியிருக்கின்ற ஒரு உரைதான் இதற்கு முத்தாய்ப்பானது. டாக்டர் கலைஞர் அவர்கள் சொல்வார்கள், இந்த உலகமானது நேற்று உயிருடன் இருந்தவரை இன்று இல்லாமல் செய்துவிட்டோம் என்ற அகந்தையை பெருமையாக கொண்டிருக்கிறது என்று சொல்வார்கள். எல்லோரும் இது ஒரு பெருமை என்று கொண்டிருக்கும்போது இட்ஸ் நாட் எ ப்ரைட், இட்ஸ் அன் அரகன்ட் ப்ரைட். அகந்தையை பெருமையாக கொண்டிருக்கிறது என்று சொல்வார்கள். அதனைத் தொடர்ந்து வள்ளுவன் சொல்லுவான், நத்தம்போல் கேடும் உளதாகும் சாக்காடும் வித்தகர்கல்லால் அரிது. கலைஞர் மீண்டும் கூறுவார், துன்பங்களுக்கிடையே கூட அவற்றை தாங்கும் வலிமையால் தமது புகழை வளர்த்து கொள்வதும் தமது சாவிலும் உள்ள புகழை நிலைநாட்டுவதும் ஆற்றல் உடையவருக்கே உரிய செயலாகும். வித்தகருக்கல்லால் மற்றவர்களுக்கு அது அரிது என்று சொல்லுவார். அத்தகைய ஒரு வித்தகனாய் தனது தனையனை இழந்துவிட்ட போதிலும் அதனை தாங்கிக் கொண்டு அந்த தனையனின் புகழ் எப்போதும் சாகாவரம் பெற்று நிற்க வேண்டும் என்று அதற்காக ஒரு அறக்கட்டளையை நீதிக்காகவும் சமத்துவத்திற்காகவும் ஜஸ்டிஸ் அண்ட் ஈக்விட்டி என்ற அடிப்படையில் அமைத்திருக்கும் நமது அன்பிற்கும் பாசத்துக்குரிய சகோதரர் என்ஆர் இளங்கோ அவர்கள் அன்றைய சோதனை மிக்க அன்ற நாளில் தமிழக முதல்வர் அவர்கள் ஓடோடி சென்று, தம்பி இளங்கோ, கழிவிறக்கம் கொள்ளாதே, எழுந்து நில், நாங்கள் துணை இருக்கின்றோம் என்று தான் மட்டுமல்லாமல் தனது சகோதர அமைச்சர்கள் பெருமக்களையும் அழைத்துச் சென்று அன்றைக்கு எழுந்து நிற்க வைத்தார்களே அன்றே ஒரு நாள். அன்று எழுந்து நின்றார்கள் என்ற சகோதரனும் என்னுடைய சகோதரியும் அந்த ஒரு நாளை நாங்கள் மறக்க முடியாது. தமிழக முதல்வர்களுக்கு நன்றி பாராட்டும் வகையில் இத்தகைய ஒரு தகவலை நான் தெரிவிக்க கடமைப்பட்டிருக்கின்றேன். அத்தகைய ஒரு இளவல் ராகேஷ் அவர்களை பற்றி தனது உணர்வுகளை பகிர்ந்து கொள்ள சகோதரர் நீதியரசர் என்ஆர்எல் ராஜா இளங்கோ அவர்களை மேடைக்கு அழைக்கின்றோம். ஐ ரெக்வெஸ்ட் ஹானரபிள் பிரதர் ஜஸ்டிஸ் இளங்கோ டு ஷேர் ஃபியூ குவாலிட்டிஸ் ஆஃப் ராகேஷ் வித் அஸ்.
வணக்கம். இது போன்ற ஓர் நிகழ்வில் நாம் கூடுவோம் என்றோ ராகேஷை பற்றி சிந்திப்போம் என்று கனவில் கூட நாம் நினைத்திருக்க மாட்டோம். எது நடக்கக்கூடாதோ அது நடந்துவிட்டது. ராகேஷ் மறைந்து அவர் புகழை இன்றைக்கு பேசுவதற்கு இங்கே வந்து நிற்கின்றோம். ராகேஷ் தந்தை தாயினுடைய அன்பு பாசம் என்கின்ற மழையிலே நனைந்து வளர்ந்த பிள்ளை. அவர்கள் காட்டிய பாசத்திற்கும் நன்றிக்கும் இணையான பாசத்தையும் அன்பையும் அவரிடத்தே காட்டி அவருடைய சொல் வழி நடந்த அற்புதமான பிள்ளை. சகோதரி ராகவியினுடைய அன்பு தம்பி என்பதை விட ஒரு தோழனாக இருந்தவர். மாமன் மாரியினுடைய மனம் நிறைந்த மருமக பிள்ளை. இல்லத்திலே இருக்கிற பெரியவர்களுக்கெல்லாம் ஓர் செல்லப்பிள்ளை. தன்னுடன் பயிலும் மாணவர்களுக்கு ஓர் தக்க தோழன். பள்ளி காலத்திலே ஆரம்பித்து கல்லூரி இறுதியாண்டு படிக்கிற வரையிலே அவர் சேர்த்து வைத்திருக்கிற நட்பின் பட்டாளத்தை நம்மால் வியந்துதான் பார்க்க முடியும். நட்பு என்பதை வெறும் வார்த்தையாக மட்டுமல்லாமல் உடுக்கை இழந்தவன் கைபோல் அங்கே இடுக்கண் களைவதாம் நட்பு என்று அந்த நண்பர்களோடு அவருடைய துயரங்களிலும் அவருடைய சங்கடங்களிலும் பங்கெடுத்து கொண்ட ஒரு அற்புதமான பிள்ளை. அந்த ராகேஷ் மறைந்த பொழுது இளங்கோவை தேற்றுவதற்காக பலர் வந்தார்கள். அவரிடத்திலே பேசுகிற பொழுது பல வியத்தகு உண்மைகளை நாங்கள் உணர்ந்தோம். இளங்கோ அவர்களோடு தொடர்பில் இருந்த கழகம் சார்ந்த கட்சிக்காரர்கள், தொழில் சார்ந்த கட்சிக்காரர்கள் அனைவரும் அவரோடு தொடர்பில் இருந்திருக்கிறார்கள் என்பது வியக்கத்தகு உண்மையாக இருந்தது. இன்னும் சொல்லப்போனால் இளங்கோ அலுவலகத்தில் இல்லாத நேரத்தில் ராகேஷ் அவருடைய பணியை மேற்கொண்டு வந்திருந்தவர்களோடெல்லாம் உரையாடி அவர்களை வியக்க வைத்திருக்கிறார். சில பேர் இளங்கோவை சந்திக்க முடியாமல் வீட்டுக்கு சென்று இளங்கோவுக்கு பதிவுகள் அனுப்பியிருக்கிறார்கள். உங்களை சந்திக்க முடியவில்லை, உங்களுடைய அற்புதமான பிள்ளையை நாங்கள் சந்தித்தோம், உங்களை விட மிக மேலான இடத்திற்கு வருவார் என்று அவர்கள் போட்ட பதிவுகளை இளங்கோ என்னோடு பகிர்ந்து கொண்டிருக்கிறார். ராகேஷ் என்கின்ற வார்த்தையே உற்சாகம் என்பதற்கு பொருளாக அமைந்தது. ராகேஷனுடைய உடல் மொழி, பேச்சு இரண்டுமே எப்பொழுதும் உற்சாகம் நிறைந்ததாக இருக்கும். அவன் உடன்படித்த மாணவர்கள் அதை உணர்ந்திருப்பார்கள். என்றைக்கும் அவருடைய முகத்திலே நான் சோகத்தை பார்த்ததில்லை. என்றைக்கும் கடுகடுத்த முகம் கிடையாது. தந்தை தாயிடத்திலே காட்டிய அன்பிலே அளப்பரிய அன்பை காட்டிய நல்ல பையன். அந்த பையனை பற்றி தேநீர் கடையிலே இருக்கிறவரை, நடைபயிற்சி செல்கிறவர்கள், உடற்பயிற்சி கூடத்திலே இருந்தவர்கள் என்று யாரை பார்த்தாலும் அந்த பையனை பற்றி சொல்லுகிற ஒரே வார்த்தை, பெரிய இடத்து பிள்ளை போல் நடந்து கொள்ள மாட்டார், எல்லோரிடத்திலும் அன்பாகவும் பணிவாகவும் நடந்து கொள்கிற அற்புதமான பிள்ளை என்று அவரை பற்றி ஒரே மரியாதை சொன்னார்கள். சரி, ராகேஷ் மறைந்து நமக்கு விட்டு சென்றிருக்கிற செய்தி என்ன என்று யோசித்து பார்த்தேன். இடி போன்ற செய்தி. இளங்கோ துவண்டு விட்டார், மீளாத்துயரில் ஆழ்ந்து விட்டார். அவரை மீட்க முடியுமா, மீண்டு வருவாரா என்ற கேள்வி ஆயிரமாய் அனைவர் மனத்திலும் நின்றது. அப்பொழுது நான் இருக்கிறேன், மீட்பேன் என்று ஆதரவு கரம் நீட்டி வந்தவர்தான் மேடையிலே அமர்ந்திருக்கும் தமிழக முதல்வர். ஆறுதல் சொல்வது மட்டுமல்ல, அவரை தட்டி கொடுத்து மீட்டெழுப்பினார். அதற்கு உதாரணம்தான் ராகேஷ் மறைந்த 10 நாட்களுக்குள்ளாக தலைவர் காட்டிய கோடு எது என்று பற்றி கொண்டு இளங்கோ அவர்கள் மீண்டு வருவேன் என்று ஓர் கட்டுரை எழுதினார். முரசொலியிலே வந்தது. அது கழகத்தினிடையே பேசு பொருளாக மாறியது. இன்றைக்கு மேடையிலே முதல்வர்கள் அமர்ந்திருக்கிறார்கள். அது அவருடைய பெருந்தன்மையை காட்டுகிறது. அவருடைய ஆழமான நட்பை காட்டுகிறது. அவர் தொண்டர்கள் மேல் கொண்டிருக்கின்ற பாசத்தை வெளிப்படுத்துகிறது. தானாக முன்வந்து மேடைக்கு வந்தார். ராகேஷ் படத்தை திறந்து வைக்கிறேன் என்று சொல்லியிருக்கிறார். அதனால் அவர் சொல்ல வருவது என்ன? தொண்டனே, உன்னுடைய குடும்பம் மட்டும் உனதல்ல, இந்த சமூகமும் உன்னுடையது. இளங்கோ போன்ற நீங்கள் எல்லாம் இந்த சமூகத்திற்கு ஆற்ற வேண்டிய பணி நிறைய இருக்கிறது. உன்னை எதிர்நோக்கி பல்வேறு பணிகள் காத்து கிடக்கின்றன. உன்னை போன்றோரை நம்பி நான் இந்த கழகத்தை நடத்தி கொண்டிருக்கிறேன். மீண்டு வா இளங்கோ என்று சொல்லுவதற்காக இந்த மேடையிலே இருக்கிறார். அந்த செய்திதான் தம்பி ராகேஷ் நமக்கு விட்டு சென்றிருக்கிற செய்தி. அப்படிப்பட்ட ராகேஷ் இன்று நம்மோடு இல்லை. ஆனால் அவருடைய அன்பான நினைவுகள், மகிழ்வான சந்திப்புகள் என்பதை கைப்பிடித்து கரங்கோர்த்து நாம் முன்னெடுத்து செல்லுவோம். அவர் பெயரால் உருவாக்கி இருக்கிற இந்த ராகேஷ் ஃபவுண்டேஷன் வெற்றிகரமாக நடைபோட துணை நிற்போம். நன்றி, வணக்கம்.
தளர்ந்து விடாதே தம்பி, எழுந்து வா, உனக்கான பணிகள் 1000 என்று கூறி ஆறுதலும் கட்டளையும் விட்ட மாண்புமிகு தமிழக முதல்வர் அவர்கள் ராகேஷ் அவர்களுடைய திருவுருவப் படத்தை தனது திருக்கரங்களால் திறந்து வைப்பார்கள். May I request the Honorable Chief Minister to unveil the Rakesh portrait. இன்றைய விழாவிற்கு வருகை தந்திருக்கக்கூடிய அனைவரையும் வரவேற்க சுந்தர் அவர்களை வரவேற்கின்றோம். ரோஜா முத்தையா ஆராய்ச்சி நூலகத்தை பற்றி ஒரு சிறிய அறிமுகம். முத்தையா என்ற ஒரு தமிழன் 1950ஆம் ஆண்டிலிருந்து அச்சிடப்பட்ட தமிழ் நூல்கள் அத்தனையும் சேகரித்து ஒரு தனிநபர் நூலகமாகவே நடத்தி கொண்டிருந்தார் என்பது நம்மில் எத்தனை பேருக்கு தெரியும். அவர் தான் கொண்ட தொழிலின் காரணமாக அவர் ரோஜா முத்தையா என்று அழைக்கப்பட்டார். அவர் ஒரு வரைவாளர். அவர் சேகரித்த அந்த நூட்களையெல்லாம் சில நல்லுள்ளங்கள் 1994ஆம் ஆண்டு அவரிடந்து பெற்று ரோஜா முத்தையா என்று அவர் பெயரிலேயே ஒரு அறக்கட்டளை ஆரம்பித்து இன்றைக்கு ரோஜா முத்தையா ஆராய்ச்சி நூலகம் என்ற ஒன்றை நடத்தி வருகிறார்கள். இந்த நூலகத்தில் ஏறத்தாழ 4 லட்சத்துக்கு மேலான தமிழில் அச்சிடப்பட்ட வெவ்வேறு துறையில் சேர்ந்த அச்சிடப்பட்ட அத்தனை நூல்களும் இருக்கிறது. தமிழ் கூறும் நல்லுலகம் கொண்ட அத்தனை தமிழ் ஆர்வலர்களும் ஆராய்ச்சியாளர்களும் அங்கிருந்து பயன்பெறுகிறார்கள். இங்கே இருக்கக்கூடியவர்கள் கூட நிச்சயமாக அந்த ஒரு நூலகத்தை நீங்கள் எல்லாம் பார்வையிட வேண்டும். அத்தகைய ரோஜா முத்தையா ஆராய்ச்சி நூலகத்தின் சார்பாக இந்த ஒரு விழா நடத்தப்படுகிறது. எனவே அதனுடைய இயக்குனர் சுந்தர் அவர்களை வரவேற்பு உரை நிகழ்த்துமாறு அழைக்கின்றேன். May I now request Thiru Sundar, the director of Roja Muthiah Research Library, to welcome the gathering.
Good morning to all of you. Beautiful soul is no more. He had to depart rather too early. Rakesh, a student of law, passed away in a road accident on the 10th of March 2022. Very quickly, his brave parents held themselves, gathered themselves, and took certain important decisions. Rakesh's father, Mr. Elango, our dear friend, respected member of Rajya Sabha, pledged his eyes to Arvind Eye Hospitals, his organs to the Rajiv Gandhi Hospital, and his body for scientific pursuit. Mrs. and Mr. N.R. Elango also decided to quickly endow a fund in the name of Rakesh through the Rakesh Law Foundation, which was founded by them. They have constituted this endowment in the Roja Muthiah Research Library, which is indeed an honor for us. The Roja Muthiah Research Library is preserving the knowledge of Tamil language, history, and culture of Tamils around the world. The library is catering to scholars and is involved in research through the Indus Research Center and the Center for Study in Public Sphere. I'm extremely happy that our Honorable Chief Minister has shown his affection to the family by gracing this occasion. Today is also Rakesh's birthday, and it was decided that we will have this event once every year on this date. So, on behalf of Roja Muthiah Research Library and the Rakesh Law Foundation, I welcome our chief guest, Mr. Kapil Sibal, Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, to deliver the first endowment lecture in this series. I warmly welcome you, sir. Mr. N. Ram, Director, Hindu Publishing Group, would be chairing the session, this event, and also would moderate the question session. A warm welcome to you, sir. I also welcome the honorable judges, honorable members of Parliament, honorable ministers, and members of Assembly, senior, junior advocates, the extended family of Mr. N.R. Elango. I also welcome Mr. Raja Elango, Justice Akbar Ali, who is gracefully comparing this event, friends, teachers, and students from the law fraternity, members of press. This is the first endowment lecture, and as I said, we plan to have these recurring lectures every year on 16th April. Once again, a warm welcome to all of you.
மகன் தந்தை காட்டும் உதவி, இவன் தந்தை என்னோட்டான் கொல்லெனும் சொல். இது நம் அனைவருக்கும் தெரிந்த ஒரு குறள். தந்தை மகர் காட்டும் நன்றி அவையத்து முந்தியிருப்பச் செயல். அது உதவி, இது நன்றி. உண்மையில் நான் இது மாற்றியிருக்க வேண்டுமோ என்று கூட நினைத்ததுண்டு. மகன் தந்தை காட்டும் உதவி, தந்தை மகனுக்கு காட்டும் நன்றி. மோப்பு குலையும் அனிச்சமாய் வாடி உதிர்ந்து விட்ட போதிலும் அதன் மனம் வையகத்தில் என்றென்றும் நிலைத்திருக்க தனையன் பெயரிலேயே ஒரு அறக்கட்டளையை நிறுவி அதன் மூலமாக அந்த தனையனுக்கு நன்றி சொல்ல வந்த ஒரு தந்தையை நாம் பார்த்து கொண்டிருக்கின்றோம். நம்முடைய அன்பிற்கும் பாசத்திற்கும் பாராட்டிற்கும் உரிய சகோதரர் மூத்த வழக்கறிஞர், மாநிலங்களவை உறுப்பினர் திரு என்.ஆர். இளங்கோ அவர்களை ராகேஷ் லா ஃபவுண்டேஷன் மற்றும் ராகேஷ் ஃபவுண்டேஷன் ஃபார் என்டோமெண்ட் ஃபார் ஜஸ்டிஸ் அண்ட் ஈக்விட்டி என்பது பற்றி ஒரு விளக்க உரையை தருமாறு அழைக்கிறேன். ஐ ரெக்வெஸ்ட் மிஸ்டர் என்.ஆர். இளங்கோ டு இன்ட்ரடியூஸ் த ராகேஷ் லா ஃபவுண்டேஷன் அண்ட் த என்டோமெண்ட் லெக்சர்ஸ்.
Most beloved senior advocate, Mr. Kapil Sibal, most respected Mr. N. Ram, senior advocate and member of parliament, Mr. P. Chidambaram, honorable judges, senior advocates, family, and friends. My son Rakesh Ranganathan was just 20 when he left due to an unfortunate car accident on 10th of March 22. Rakesh was a nice kid. He always did things that made me and his mother proud. He always made sure that he kept us happy. As said by Justice Raja Elango, Rakesh means enthusiasm, energy, and Rakesh means happiness. He might have left us thinking that life after 20 was boring and that involved worldly affairs that would have driven him to sadness. My family and I had two choices, either to grieve his death or to celebrate his short, beautiful life that he lived. Rakesh would have definitely wanted us to pick the second one, and hence we have decided to celebrate his life. On behalf of my family, request all of you to celebrate the sweet memories and wonderful life of Rakesh. Today, 16th of April 2022, is his 21st birthday. I want all of you to celebrate his birthday. Justice Akbarali was mentioning about Thirukural. With the permission of chair, I will have few sentences in Tamil. நெருநல் உளனொருவன் இன்றில்லை என்னும் பெருமை உடைத்து இவ்வுலகு. அதனுடைய பொருளையும் நீதியரசர் சொன்னார்கள். நிலையாமை பற்றி திருவள்ளுவன் மட்டுமல்ல, ரோம பேரரசன் மார்க்கஸ் தன்னுடைய மெடிடேஷன் புத்தகத்திலே நிலையாமையை பற்றி மிக விரிவாக எழுதியிருக்கிறார். கணியன் பூங்குன்றனாருடைய யாதும் ஊரே அந்த பாடலில் கூட நிலையாமை குறித்து மிக விரிவாக சொல்லப்பட்டிருக்கிறது. ஆனால் நிலையாமை குறித்து சொன்ன வள்ளுவன் இறந்தார் பற்றி ஒரு குறள் சொல்லியிருக்கிறான். அதாவது இல்வாழ்க்கையில் இருப்பவருடைய கடமையை குறித்து, துறந்தார்க்கும் துவாதார்க்கும் இறந்தார்க்கும் இல்வாழ்வான் என்பான் துணை. அதாவது வாழ்க்கையை துறந்தவர்களுக்கும் வறியவர்களுக்கும் தன்னோடு இருந்து இறந்தவர்களுக்கும் இல்வாழ்க்கையில் இருப்பவன் துணையாக இருக்க வேண்டும் என்று. எனவே ராகேஷுடைய கடமைகளை, அவனுடைய கனவுகளை அறிந்த நான் அவைகளை நிறைவேற்றுவதை இல்வாழ்க்கையில் என்னுடைய கடமையாக நினைக்கிறேன். அந்த கடமைகளை நிறைவேற்றும் போது என்னுடைய நண்பர்களாக உள்ள நீங்கள் அனைவரும் எனக்கு உரிய மன வலிமையை தருவீர்கள் என்று நான் நம்புகிறேன். The topic of today's lecture was also a question that came up on Rakesh's mind, and he later posed me one day. He asked me if Dr. Ambedkar was alive, what would have he thought of the Constitution? I answered him that the Constitution is a living document and it will have to undergo changes as the society mandates. However, our discussion never came to an end. Now, I look upon these two eminent persons in their own fields to shed some light on the topic and enlighten all of us. I have decided to establish Rakesh Law Foundation with Roja Muthiah Memorial Library. The foundation is created with an object to educate and empower law students. It aims to engage the law students intellectually that will benefit the society to greater extent. The trustees of RMRL have kindly consented to do the same. Every year on this day, 16th April, a lecture will be arranged and an eminent jurist will be requested to deliver the lectures. Though I am in politics, the object and intention of this endowment is completely apolitical. The views of everybody about justice and equity will be reflected in the lecture series, because I strongly believe that only discussions and deliberations lead to the best decisions. The topics essentially will be whether the law is correctly enacted, properly executed, and at times whether properly interpreted. A political tinge may be there and that cannot be avoided, but I assure one and all that Rakesh Law Foundation and its endeavors are completely apolitical. I have requested RMRL to arrange for lectures on the topics of law and social justice that Rakesh was very fond of. I request all of you to stand with me and my family in this journey, guide us and help us in achieving this object. Thank you.
Now it is time for us to introduce the guest speaker who needs no introduction at all. I have taken this pleasure of introducing Mr. Kapil Sibal, the senior advocate, the Honorable Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, A lawyer, a jurist, a politician of a class, senior leader under the Indian National Congress, a seasoned parliamentarian and honorable minister in the cabinet of UPA 1 and 2, holding 3 portfolios, an effective orator, everybody knows an effective orator, both before the court as well as in the parliament. Another towering personality will be here who will vouch with me, his colleague. The soft side of him, which I know, is that he is a poet, and he has published 2 volumes of poetry. One is Eyewitness, and the other is My World Within. And today he has also authored another book which has been presented to the Honorable Chief Minister, The Shades of Truth. A defender of Constitution of India, and has fought many battles in the courts of law for the constitutional rights of the citizens. I can go on narrate many things about Mr. Kapil Sibal, who was born on 8th August 1948 at Jalandhar and completed his degrees in history and law at the University of Delhi, later in Cambridge in America, and after he declined an offer of joining Indian civil services. Sir, we would have been lost you, sir. And he has adorned the many roles of a lawyer, senior advocate, and additional Solicitor General of India. I only quote only one of his tweets. When the government amended the IAS cadre rules, he tweeted, "Yet another assault on the federal structure? What about cooperative federalism? Our constitution should not become a victim of the famous adage and Hindi adage, Jiski lati, uski bains." I think my pronunciation is correct, sir. Jiski lati, uski bains, which means he who has the stick wants the buffaloes. Yaar kaiyila kuchi irukko avanukku dhaan erma maadu sondam. It is befitting for a towering personality like Mr. Kapil Sibal to deliver the first lecture on this endowment. Is this democracy envisaged by the framers of the Constitution? This is the question, sir, as rightly raised by Mr. Elango, in everyone's mind, sir. I would like you to answer this and dwell on this subject, sir. Over to you, sir. Thank you very much.
The Chair, Mr. N. Ram, my dear friend Elango, Justice Akbar Ali, Sundar, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On the 10th of March of this year, the cruel hand of fate took away a flower that was yet to bloom fully, took away the fragrance of the garden of your house. Yet we must live on, and I am proud of you that you have institutionalized his memory in this fashion. Thank you very much. We all have to be part of this journey. For a young man who was in the 4th year of his law, ready to start practicing in court and share with others the vision, his ideas of the Constitution as it would have unfolded before his eyes. But that was not to be. We are here to, as you rightly said, to commemorate his life for the last 20 years. And I consider it a privilege to start and to inaugurate the first lecture of the foundation, Rakesh Law Foundation, the endowment of which is in the Roja Muthiah Library. The topic is this the democracy envisaged by the founders of our Constitution? Very few people really quite understand what a constitution means. What is a constitution? It's the architecture, the framework of various organs of state which collaborate with each other and are in conflict with each other from time to time for the welfare of the people. That's what a constitution is. Within that process, there are checks and balances which institutions which are set under the constitution ensure that the vision of our forefathers is kept intact as the constitution works itself. The word democracy has many meanings, but in the context of our constitution, our particular constitution, democracy means, and it is set out in the various provisions of the constitution, to ensure that the institutions of the state work for the welfare of the people, and that the welfare of the people is foremost in the minds of those who run the government. And in that process, every voice needs to be heard. Every cry of pain needs to be recognized. And every achievement needs to be applauded. That's what true democracy means. Are we a true democracy? It's a question that all of us nowadays ask ourselves. And I feel somewhat saddened to say that we are not. Our democracy starts with an election and ends with its result. Beyond that, there is very little that I see today in the functioning of those institutions that are central to our democracy. The Constitution, if you look at have a panoramic view of the Constitution, you will see that the Constitution talks about the functioning of various pillars of government, or pillars of the state, in a sense. You have the judiciary that is obligated under the Constitution to protect us, our fundamental rights. You have Parliament that enacts laws consistent with the Constitution, supposed to be consistent with the Constitution. You have a government that implements laws. You have a public service commission that ensures that the bureaucracy in the country works within the norms set out under the conditions of service. You have an election commission that ensures that the elections are free and fair. And you have various other organs of the state, other institutions of the state that allow democracy to flourish. These institutions include universities, include research institutions, include the institution of the governor. And so the Constitution really tells you about how these various institutions are constituted and how they must function. But that's nothing to do with the vision of our forefathers. For the vision of our forefathers is encapsulated in Part 4 of the Constitution. That's the vision. If we achieve that vision, we will actually be a truly democratic nation. And I want to read to you Article 37 of the Constitution, which is Part 4 of the Constitution, which says the following, and I'll read it to you. It says, the provisions contained in this part, that is Part 4, shall not be enforceable by any court, but the principles therein laid down are nevertheless fundamental, mark the words, fundamental in the governance of the country. And it shall be the duty of the state to apply these principles in making laws. In other words, even though Part 4 cannot be implemented through a court process, you cannot issue a mandamus in court for the implementation of Part 4, yet Article 37 says, nevertheless, what is set out here, the principles set out here, are fundamental in the governance of the country, and it shall be the duty of the state to apply these principles in making laws. In other words, when Parliament enacts law, it must enact it in the context of the principles set out in this part. That's fundamental in the governance of the country. Now, what is the first principle that is set out? And that's in Article 38. It says, state to ensure a social order for the promotion of the welfare of the people. The state shall strive to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting as effectively as it may a social order in which justice, social, economic and political shall inform all institutions of national life. Now let's just pause here. What does this mean? It means that if Parliament is to enact laws, the objective of the law must be that it must secure and protect a social order in which justice, social, economic, and political must inform all institutions of public life. Now let us test that. Therefore, the Constitution and the forefathers envisaged social justice, economic justice, and political justice. So when Parliament makes laws, it must be tested on the touchstone. Does it in any way ensure the protection of social justice, economic justice, and political justice? And I'm afraid that just the opposite is happening in India. Just the opposite. Laws perpetrate social injustice, they perpetrate economic injustice, and they perpetrate political injustice. And courts of law have never tested the laws that are enacted in this country on the fundamentals of Article 38 of the Constitution, of the Constitution, because Article 37 says only such laws should be made that secure social, economic, and political justice. Now let's test. I think the most draconian law in this country is the 10th schedule of the Constitution. The most draconian practice in this country is the practice of the whip in Parliament. It destroys the very concept of political justice. Imagine I am a member of Parliament, Elango is a member of Parliament. He represents a constituency. We are in Rajya Sabha. He represents a state. I represent another state. My dear friend Chidambaram, now in Rajya Sabha, was in Lok Sabha, so was I, represents a particular constituency. Now he, as a matter of law and in the context of political justice, has the right to speak up for his constituency, to articulate the vision of those constituents who have elected him, or her, as the case may be. But in Parliament you sit and the party tells you, this is how you're going to vote on this bill. You have no voice. You cannot articulate what your constituents want. Is that political justice? When a bill is passed, you may have several misgivings. But you have to pass the bill because the party issues the whip. You cannot voice your opinion in Parliament. Is that political justice? What is happening in Parliament today? What is happening in states today? There's a 10th schedule. If you vote against the whip, you will be disqualified. Is that political justice? You may not agree with the bill. If you voluntarily give up membership of the party, you will lose your seat, you will be disqualified. What is happening today? Elections are held, governments are formed, governments are destroyed. 10 people, 20 people are bought over. They violate the whip. The established government falls. those very people, because if the established government falls, assembly is dissolved, elections are held, those very people who have violated the whip, made the government fall, are elected and become ministers. Is that political justice? En masse resignations take place. 20 people resign from one party because they are promised a ticket, a ministership, a membership of a board, a chairmanship of a board. They resign. They resign from the party. Government becomes a minority. Elections take place. They get into parliament, or they get into the assembly. New government is formed. They become ministers. Is that political justice? These laws are handmaids of political injustice. It's the very destruction of the concept of political justice envisaged in Article 38 of the Constitution. Why is it that in countries, parliamentary democracies like the UK and the US, there is no such thing as a whip? Therefore, presidents in the United States actually, Republican president has to actually go to Democratic members and seek their support for a bill which the Republicans, part of the Republicans oppose. Similarly in Great Britain. I can understand a whip issued when their budget is going to be passed, because in the absence of a budget, the government will fall. I can understand that. I can understand that on a major policy decision, a whip is issued. I can understand that if there's a no confidence motion against the government, you have to support the government to make sure that your government maintains power, is secure. But I can't understand the very concept of a whip in respect of legislations, ordinary legislations, say the PMLA, the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, UAPA, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. Why should members of parliament not be allowed to raise their concerns about these acts? This is the very antithesis of political justice. And so, what happens in the process is a majority government, because of its majority, passes these laws. They are the most draconian laws in the country. And we've seen what's happening around this country, how these laws are misused against political opponents, whether it's in Maharashtra or it's any other state. Suddenly you find the enforcement directorate reaching out against somebody who's spoken against the government. Under the UAPA, what is happening? How many terrorists have been imprisoned under the UAPA? It's mostly students, academics, those who dissent against the government, people who protest against the government. Why is that happening? That's happening because these laws are passed by majorities, absolute majorities. There is no chance to dissent because of the whip. There is no public debate. Is that what the constitution makers wanted? And this is despite a judgment, a constitution bench judgment in the Kyoto Holohan case, which says that the whip should only be used at the time of a no confidence motion and at the time of the budget being passed. Despite the declaration of the law, parties issue whips, we have to obey whips, and this is despite the fact that under Article 105 of the Constitution, members of Parliament have freedom of speech in Parliament. Economic justice. Let's talk of economic justice. 1% of the people in this country, 1%, account for 22% of the national income of this country. 1%. 10% account for 57% of the national income of this country. This is the World Inequality Report. There's an Oxfam inequality report. 10% have amassed 45% of the national wealth. And 6% of the population shares 50% of the national wealth of this country. 142 Indians, just 142 Indians, have a collective wealth of 53 lakh crores. It's 1.5 times the budget. Just 142 Indians. And what is the directive principles of state? What does Article 38 say? Economic justice. Is that anything to do with economic justice? The wealth of 10 richest can actually fund school and higher education. Just the wealth of 10 richest for 25 years. 1% wealth tax on the 98 billionaires in this country will fund Ayushman Bharat for more than 7 years. That's the state of the economy. The Pew Research Institute of 2021 says a year ago, 60 million earned less than rupees $2 a day. 60 million. And in the year 2021, this number increased to 134 million. So poverty is increasing, and the rich are getting richer. And the laws in this country are helping the rich to get richer. The Azim Premji Institute says 23 crore people were pushed into poverty in 2020. 23 crore people. Rural poverty increased by 15% and urban poverty increased by 20%. In the Global Hunger Index of 2021, India is at 101 out of 116 countries. Lower than Nepal at 76, Bangladesh at 76, and Pakistan at 93. There's another very, very strange provision in our Constitution. I've never understood it. That's Article 164, capital 1B, which says that if a person is disqualified under the 10th schedule, I'm sorry I'm coming back to that, but I thought I should mention it. If a person is disqualified under the 10th schedule, then his disqualification shall remain only till he fights the next election. So in other words, if he violates the whip, makes a government fall, and the next election takes place, he becomes a minister. And the Constitution says that's okay. So there is no concept of political justice in the context of our laws. There is no concept of economic justice in the functioning of government. And laws are used to not prosecute, but persecute people. We're seeing it every day. Just this morning, there was a news item that said that somebody in Agra who eloped with a girl, his house was burnt because she belonged to another religion. Between 2009 to 2019, 91% of hate crimes took place between 2014 and 2019. And minorities, the hate crimes against minorities represented 73% of all those hate crimes. And of the 73%, Muslims were victims in 61%. How do we explain that? There's another provision in the Constitution, I think it's Article 48. Let me read it. It's a very interesting provision. It says, the state shall endeavor to organize agriculture and animal husbandry on modern and scientific lines, and shall in particular take steps for preserving and improving the breeds and prohibiting the slaughter of cows and calves and other milch and draft cattle. In other words, the Constitution prohibits the slaughter of cows who give milk, and the slaughter of calves and the slaughter of draft cattle. Draft cattle are cattle who plow the fields. The farmer plows the fields with draft cattle. And you have a law which is against cow slaughter. The law against cow slaughter is contrary to Article 48 of the Constitution, because a law against cow slaughter is antithetical to the article. Why? Because it's only milch cattle that cannot be slaughtered. And yet, a political party uses this for political advantage, knowing full well that this is contrary to the Constitution. For a farmer, a cow that does not give milk is of no use. So he sells it. But selling that cow is a crime because you'll get lynched. And if the cow strays, then it's a traffic hazard. And it, in fact, the sale of that cow boosts the economy in a different way because the skin is used, and the Dalits use it, for trade. Goods are manufactured and they are sold. Now that whole economy is destroyed because of a law which is inconsistent, and yet a particular political party uses it to political advantage. How do you justify it? The result is you have cow shelters. Now cows die in cow shelters. And the subsidy that is given for each cow is 30 rupees a day, which is not enough to feed anybody, any cow. So they die. They are put to no use. Thousands and lakhs of people have lost their trade and lost their business. And this very article, which prohibits not slaughtering of cows, but only milch cows, is used for politics. How do you justify it? A state where the business community owns mainstream media and funds the political party, which gives advertisements to mainstream media and runs a campaign to ensure that a single narrative reaches the people of this country. You cannot explain that. Constitutionally, it's unacceptable. Well, big business houses give money to the government through electoral bonds. And when money is given to the government through electoral bonds, big business houses need favors, quid pro quo. These very houses own mainstream television channels. So they run the agenda of the government on those television channels. The alternative narrative is not allowed to be shown. So there is a vicious conspiracy by the corporate sector, the government, the political party in power, and the funding of that political party through electoral bonds. And the court doesn't want to hear the matter. How does the court justify that? How can the court sit silently in this act of political injustice, which has subverted the Constitution of India, contrary to the very concept of Article 37 and 38 of the Constitution? How does anybody justify it? The court chooses not to listen to these matters, not to hear these matters. I know for a fact that when it comes to disqualification of members of the opposition in a state assembly, that matter is never heard. It lingers on for years and years and years. And suddenly when something happens in Rajasthan with another political party, which is in government, the matter is heard in the Supreme Court the next day or a few days thereafter. And then it is to be heard day to day. How does a court justify that? So if the court is silent and the people are not heard and the corporate sector funds a political party and the government funds mainstream media controlled by the corporate sector, how is that democracy? What has that got to do with the welfare of the people, which is the heart, the conscience of 37 of the article, of Article 37 of the Constitution? How do you justify that? And is democracy only about having an election? The Election Commission is supposed to ensure that elections are fair and free. In the context of what I have told you, elections are unfree because of electoral bonds. And therefore they can't be fair. And how does then the court not hear such matters? For years. Demonetization happened on the 8th of November 2016, where in 2022 the matter is still not heard. How does an institution like the court justify that? So if the Election Commission is compromised, the finance minister is not consulted during demonetization, how do we call ourselves a democracy? The only democracy we have, if we can call it democracy, is to ensure that an election takes place and to make sure that a particular party wins. That's the meaning of democracy in India, as I understand it today. And that also through a machine. I vote for a particular candidate and the machine counts my vote. I think that's an anachronism. How can I allow my vote to be counted by a machine? In Germany, the use of the machine, like all other countries in the world, has been rejected. But in Germany, there's a philosophical reason why it was rejected. And it's part of the speeches in Parliament. They said, we've gone through a process of a monster who ruled our country, a dictator. Whether the machine can be manipulated or not is not the issue. If it can be manipulated, it may be manipulated, then the person who manipulates it will always win an election. And that will lead to another dictatorship. We cannot allow that. I have a fundamental issue with the machine counting my vote. And it's not for me to prove that it's manipulated or not. That's not my job. That's the job of the Election Commission. And the Election Commission, when we raise issues before the Election Commission, they put up a wall and say, look, you tell us how people manipulate. I can't tell you how people manipulate. If sitting in the United States of America, you can, or through Pegasus, you can find out what's happening in my home, then what's the machine which costs 15,000 rupees? So the fact of the matter is that there is silence all around. Nobody speaks. In Russia, there are protests against Putin. In Pakistan, the Supreme Court of Pakistan does what it should do. And here, we are all silent. We choose not to speak. We choose not to protest. And the institutions are collaborators in this farce of democracy. They collaborate with government, with the party. Just a few houses, some of them from Tamil Nadu, some outside of Tamil Nadu as well, choose to raise the voice. I can go on and on. Look at what's happening with Digital India. 24% of schools in India had internet connection during the pandemic. Of the poorest people in India, just about 12%, 6 to 12% have any form of computers, any form of Wi-Fi. In schools, by and large in schools, a very, very small percentage have working computers. And we talk about Digital India. The fiber optic network was supposed to connect 250,000 gram panchayats. They have not yet even connected 150,000. And now the Prime Minister has made a statement that I'll connect all villages. Well, I don't know when that will be connected. By that time, we'll all be disconnected. How is that social justice? That's not social justice. 37% of the children born in this country are stunted. 30% in urban areas and more in rural areas. Women are anemic. Children become anemic. The expenditure on healthcare by the government is 1% of GDP. They said they'd make it, healthcare expenditure should be 2.5% of GDP in the years to come. Said by 2025. It's not going to happen. The United States spends 16% of GDP on healthcare. UK and other countries spend 10% of GDP in healthcare. Is that social justice? We're talking about justice, social, economic and political. It is the perpetration of injustice, social injustice, economic injustice, political injustice. Incomes. The household incomes, and I think that 24%, rather, about 800 million people earn less than 10,000 rupees a month in this country. 67% of the households in this country earn less than 10,000 rupees a month, as opposed to the number of billionaires that are produced every year in this country. So what has happened is that those who are constitutionally obliged to listen don't listen, and those who have the freedom to speak have stopped speaking. So for if you don't speak and those in power don't listen, there will be no dialogue. And if there is no dialogue, there can't be democracy. That's the state of affairs in India. I can go on and on about other provisions of the Constitution, but I think this is not what our forefathers envisaged. The fault lies with us, for we choose not to stand up. It's time for India to stand up. It's time for you and I to stand up. For if we don't, democracy will perish. We will not let that happen. Thank you very much.
Sir, it's an outstanding, sir. We can see the anguish in your speech, the pain in your speech. As rightly pointed out by you, we cannot now be silent. And we have to stand up and say what is right and what is wrong, sir. I thank you very much for your enlightened speech on this question. Now it's my duty to introduce Mr. Ram, the chairperson of today's event, and also who needs no introduction. Out of 4 pillars of the democracy, the legislative, the executive, the judicial, and the press, the Hindu group of publications have always stood for the democracy. And more particularly Mr. Ram, who is a challenger of communalism and the fundamentalism and known for his communal harmony. Sir, he is the president of the Harmony India, an organization dedicated to the promotion of the communal harmony and secularism in Chennai, sir. May I request Mr. Ram to address the gathering.
Thank you, Justice Akbar Ali, Mr. Kapil Sibal, Mr. Elango, distinguished guests. I'm here mainly as a moderator, and in keeping with the wishes of Mr. Kapil Sibal, a conversationalist, because he thought it would be a good idea to engage in an informal, free conversation, but on the subject that he has spoken. His lecture is about, and that's what I'll do. But before that, I want to pay my tribute to Rakesh and the wonderful family of which he was a part. We cannot possibly overpraise the strength of character and the moral courage of Mr. Elango, his wife, and other members of the family in taking this decision to transition from inconsolable grief, a terrible happening, to this point where we celebrate institutionally the life just cut off and wonderful spirit of a young man, I think cannot possibly be overpraised. And the Rakesh Law Foundation, which has been inaugurated today in the presence of the Chief Minister and by a very distinguished lecturer, I think has been rightly constituted It's dedicated to justice and equity. The endowment is in the right place, the Roja Muthiah Research Library, and I'm sure year after year, along the lines indicated by Mr. Elango in his very moving but powerful speech, I think this will go forward, and we look forward to this annual lecture on various subjects. He's made it clear it's not going to be very narrow. Its focus will be on these values, justice and equity, and it is, he said, is going to be apolitical in the formal sense, although you cannot avoid politics when you deal with these values and principles. The theme addressed with erudition and powerful insights in this inaugural lecture by Mr. Kapil Sibal is the content and state of democracy, the quality of democracy today in relation to the Constitution. And he has stayed entirely within the framework of the Constitution in elucidating his ideas and presenting his impressions and also assessments, which have been backed up. I think every strong statement, every insight has been substantiated, and I think that's a valuable part of this this inaugural lecture. The transformative living Constitution, although it's got its imperfections, and our democratic assets, Parliament and state legislatures, the executive at the center and in the states, political parties, the judiciary, other institutions that function under constitutional or statutory authority, the news media, civil society organizations, and in the final analysis, we, the people of India, individually and collectively, to quote from the Constitution itself, all these have a vital role to play in this. And the Constitution has been designed, and the democratic, at least formally democratic institutions are all formally pledged to promote fealty not to any strongman or to any kind of majoritarianism, but to the core values of the Indian Republic as set out in the preamble. And in this order, I think the order is important: justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. So we have heard in this brilliant inaugural lecture how seriously these values, the law and the courts of law have taken these values. That matters a good deal, but how society and the political system respond to them matters, I think, even more. I just want to recall something, since Mr. Elango referred to Dr. Ambedkar in connection with the questions asked by his son. In his last speech to the Constituent Assembly, made on November 25, 1949, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, chairman of the drafting committee, brought out clearly and powerfully the importance of understanding the interdependence of the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and getting what he called the union of Trinity right. He warned, of course, against internal threats to democracy and society, such as bhakti or hero worship in politics, to which Indians were particularly addicted. It's quite possible, he mused, for this newborn democracy to retain its form but give place to dictatorship in fact. If there's a landslide, and he was no doubt referring to an electoral landslide, the danger of the second possibility becoming actuality is much greater, he said. In support of this argument, Dr. Ambedkar recalled John Stuart Mill's famous caution to people interested in the maintenance of democracy not to lay their liberties at the feet of even a great man or to treat him with powers which enable him to subvert their institutions. But equally important, and I think this came out very clearly in this inaugural lecture, was Dr. Ambedkar's warning in his speech against letting the complete absence of two things in Indian society, equality, that is social and economic, and fraternity, continue unchecked. That is the absence of two things in Indian society, social and economic equality. Mr. Kapil Sibal also spoke about political justice here, and fraternity continue unchecked. If the contradiction between recognizing what he called the principle of one man, one vote, and one vote, one value in social and economic life was not, in politics, the contradiction between the principle of one man, one vote, one vote, and one vote, one value in politics, and denying the principle of one man, one value, or equality in social and economic life, if this contradiction was not resolved, he said, political democracy could not be expected to survive. How long shall we continue to live this life of contradictions, he demanded. How long shall we continue to deny equality in our social and economic life? If we continue to deny it for long, we will do so only by putting our political democracy in peril. We must remove this contradiction, he said, at the earliest possible moment, or else those who suffer from equality, I think this is very important, will blow up the structure of political democracy which this assembly has so laboriously built up. Mr. Kapil Sibal has touched on these issues, focused on some of them, but entered it in a different way by focusing on how what the Constitution fundamentally intended or designed has been honored mainly in the breach by the Constitution of the various institutions as well as their functioning, he said. And he illustrated it with great insight and persuasive power. Of course, there could be differences on this, some in the audience, and normally a lecture of this kind ends with the lecture and there are no questions, but Mr. Kapil Sibal has thought it was appropriate that a subject like this should involve more people, and it will start with a conversation, but also there will be opportunities, at least to a limited extent, for questions which he will answer. So, Mr. Sibal, you have provided something that is often not heard on part 4 of the Constitution. Why is it that the framers of the Constitution stopped short of making this mandatory? And what was the thinking behind that? Because it has provided an escape route out at the very outset. So while distinguished people of the law and public intellectuals, academics like you, writers, have emphasized it, why is it that they did not make it more binding?
That's very simple. You see, you cannot have a mandamus by the court directing the government to remove inequalities of income, for example. You can't have a mandamus. But courts have forgotten that in Article 37, all laws must further the cause of social, economic, and political justice. So you can test a law, right? So I have no quarrels with the proposition that, look, the court cannot direct a law to be framed to remove inequality or to have a uniform civil code or, for that matter, to protect cows, milch cows. But if there is a law which does not protect them, the court can enforce it. But the court have not started doing it. That's why today I formulated a proposition that in fact these laws can be tested for being contrary to the policies enunciated, which are the objectives of the state, in part 4 of the Constitution. And I think this is the starting point of that conversation, and that is why I raised it.
Have there been any court judgments that provide an entry into this?
Not so far. For example, I'll give you an example. One of the provisions of the Constitution in Part 4 says that the material resources of the community must subserve the common good, must be used to subserve the common good. Right? That's one of them. Now, the material resources of the community are actually subserving the interests of individuals today. You have people getting all the airports in this country. You have people getting all the ports in this country. Right? There are monopolies being created. Now, how do you then, these are material resources of the community. Take even the telecom sector. Yeah. Spectrum is a material resource which belongs to the people of India. But instead of 10 players or 11 players, we have only two really effective players in the market today. So why can't a law be tested on the grounds of Article 37, 38, 39? Why can't it be tested? We're not asking the court to give a mandamus to ensure that such a law be passed. That can't be done. But if there is a monopoly of resources which belong to the community, the court can say that's not what the constitution makers envisaged, and we can strike it down on that ground. That step has not been taken so far, and that's why I raised this issue today in this inaugural lecture.
Yeah. Coming to the whip, which this is on political justice, you made a very persuasive case. The freedom of speech as well as freedom of action of elected members of parliament and by extension legislatures, state legislatures, how that has been restricted or suppressed by this practice. Yes, in the US it's not there, but in the UK there is a whip, but the crucial difference seems to be that you can't be disqualified. You can be thrown out of the party or de-recognized. So the argument would be that in the interest of political stability, this was necessary. Otherwise, governments will fall very frequently. And given the corruption in this country, in the political system, you can buy the votes by members of parliament, as has been done through various inducements. So what's the answer to that? What will happen if this were not there? This restriction were not there.
What has happened since it is there?
Yes.
See what has happened. The answer is in that question.
Yes.
That the very things that you're talking about, buying people, is happening despite the 10th schedule.
Yes.
So what will happen in that process is that if there are people who are not bound by the whip, the conversation will take place. Right? You can't buy everybody. I mean, there are 5, 10, 20, 5%, 6%, 10% may be up for sale, but not everybody is up for sale. So you will have a far more democratic way of dealing with legislation and far more informed legislation in the country. Because now nothing is sent to the select committee or the standing committee. Right? Just laws are passed because you have brute majority. So there's no conversation, there's no dialogue. At least in that process, there'll be dialogue. This law has failed, that's certain. Whether that will fail or not is yet another question to be answered, but time will tell.
Since 2014, we have seen a worsening of the situation so far as communal relations are concerned. And you spoke about the nexus between those in power at the center and big business, big capital, also media and so on. Don't you think the coalescence of this communal orientation with unprecedented support from big business in many ways, that is at the root, that is at the heart of what is now seen as authoritarianism, which goes in the name of a majority. I would call it Hindutva authoritarianism. Because it's very out in the open. Because it's not that we haven't seen these authoritarian trends earlier, anti-democratic trends earlier. You had the emergency, you have various violations of the values that you spoke about. But this is something new. How different is it? Is it this coalescence that explains this authoritarianism? The kind of
I think it's more than that. Coalition is just one part of it. The real problem in this is that states which are governed by political parties, the enforcement agencies have collaborated with the state.
Yes.
So if the policeman collaborates with the rioter, right, and the judiciary remains silent, then you will have the 80-20 formula. Well, that's what's happening in this country. So it's much more than the coalescence of those forces. It is it's the collaboration of the enforcement agencies, the investigating agencies that present the matter to the court, and the court being unable to do anything about it. And that's the heart of the problem. It doesn't happen in many other states. It only happens in states where the collaboration is complete. But there are, of course, some states where that doesn't happen. So you will find this only in certain states in India. Or you don't find this mostly in this part of the country.
And the laws that have given unprecedented powers to some of these central agencies.
Oh, that's most dangerous. That's most dangerous. Now, I'll give you an example. You know, in the CBI cannot investigate a case in a state unless the state gives consent. Now, of course, states have started withdrawing consent because they know that they are being persecuted by the CBI at the instance of a political party. But see the Enforcement Directorate. As far as the CBI is concerned, there is a Clause 6. There is a Clause 6 in the Delhi Special Police Establishment Act. There's a Clause 6 which requires consent. Yeah. But under the PMLA, there is no consent provision, which means that the central agency can go into any state in the country without a law relating to consent and investigate anybody they like. And this is exactly what they are doing. I mean, I have done matters where the PMLA, as you know, has come into force in 2005. It became law in 2005. But they are prosecuting people for transactions that happened much before 2005. Much before the even law came into force. And amendments have been passed in the PMLA through the money bill course. In other words, amendments which have nothing to do with the money bill, passed in Lok Sabha, not cleared in Rajya Sabha because they can't be cleared in Rajya Sabha because it's part of the money bill. And those amendments now say that you can prosecute a man under the PMLA for what happened prior to 2005. And courts are not willing to decide those matters. That's why I said that the whole system there is a breakdown of our constitutional system. It's a complete breakdown.
A lot of the accountability, it appears, can be placed at the door of the higher judiciary in this country. Would you agree with that?
No, I think that, no, it's not, no, I think that the judiciary must share the blame for not taking up matters. But the judiciary is not that hard the problem. The problem lies with the political system as it has been created after 2014. If you capture all institutions and they become captive to you, and bureaucracy, which is supposed to stand up and say the right thing to the political powers that be, if they are chosen to do the diktat of the government, so the bureaucracy is actually a collaborator, the investigating agency is a collaborator, the university system become collaborators, right? And goons run universities and enter universities. And universities are no longer centers of academics, right? But centers of political influencing. Then there is no hope, because wealth is created in the university system. Wealth is not created by industry. Wealth is created through ideas. And ideas happen in the university system. So if a university moves away from ideas, right, and become war zones in which ideologies take center stage, there will be no wealth creation in this country.
On the judiciary again, you mentioned the much acclaimed order of the Supreme Court of Pakistan at a crucial moment, how quickly they acted, and so would you like to, you've studied the order, would you like to say something about that? And if you like, any contrast with our situation?
Tomorrow I'll be trolled, you know that, if I say something.
Okay, we won't go into that. Turning to another subject which hasn't figured today much, center-state relations and the idea of federalism such as it is in the Constitution. It has been raised powerfully in this state by the Chief Minister and the ruling party, as well as some others. The assault on federalism designed by the Constitution. States have been dealt with under the Constitution. Would you like to?
Yeah, you see, I think that, first of all, I don't think we're a truly federal country. It's not a federal structure. It's not a federal constitution. It's quasi-federal. It's mostly unitary because the powers, financial powers, are controlled by the central government. And therefore, what happens is that the states never get their share. The real problem, according to me, because when the Constitution was framed in 1950, when we adopted it, it really was, in a sense, structured on the basis of the 1935 Act, where the colonial power used to control through governors. That system continued. Now, the problem is that most of the subjects which should be in the state list are now in the concurrent list. For example, I'll give you an example of education. Education is a subject in the concurrent list. So the central government now can pass a law and say, okay, we'll have a central test, for example, CEC or whatever it is, for entry into university system. Yet another burden, because the diversity of education in this country is so large that it's impossible for equity. Equity and justice, as we are talking about, are Siamese twins. In the absence of justice, in the absence of equity, there can be no justice, and there cannot be equity without justice. Right? That's the reality. Now the question is, how do you bring equity into the system? You have, for example, a NEET exam.
Yes.
Right? And Tamil Nadu is very much against it, and so am I, personally.
And you're former minister in charge of that.
Yes, I was, yes. And no, but I didn't introduce the NEET.
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's right.
So the point is, how does a state board, living in functioning under the state board, how does he compete? I mean, all the curricula is based on CBSE. And this happens all over the country. It's not just Tamil Nadu. I personally think that education should be a state subject, completely a state subject. I think health should be a state subject. Health and education should be state subjects. Let states compete. We need to amend the constitution. We need to make sure that panchayats, the finances, devolve on panchayats, that panchayats are in charge of water, about basic necessities of life. I think we must get rid of this colonial structure that we've inherited under the constitution. Then only federalism will flower. And I think that we can only grow as a nation if we are a truly federal nation.
And India needs federalism more than ever, more than it did at the founding of the Constitution.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because the enormous diversity. I always used to say, as a minister, that look, how do I frame a law? Because it cannot apply everywhere.
Yeah.
Because you want to set up schools in Himachal, it's different from setting up schools in Arunachal Pradesh. How do you, and it's different from setting up schools in Chhattisgarh. The topography is different, the challenges are different, levels of poverty are different, teachers are not available in certain states. How do you bring teachers into the system? You can't have education without teachers. We are now delivering education without teachers. This is the sad part. And we think that this digitization is going to solve everything. It's the human touch that matters. It's the values that the child will get that matter.
So before I invite questions, comments from our guests, a lot of people get dispirited. How do you ever overcome this kind of authoritarianism, majoritarianism, electoral success? In the latest round, you saw that. So what's the answer to that?
The answer is people versus. It must be people versus, not political parties versus. People must rise. We must stand up.
But we know that spontaneous movements do well up to a particular point and then dissipate or fade away. You need political organization.
Yeah, it'll come. It'll come. It'll come with the movement. And slowly I see that happening. People are unhappy, but people don't have an alternative. And those who can provide an alternative are choosing not to do so. That's the unkindest cut of all.
Is it because they are demoralized or?
No, I think that the problem with our country is that those who can oppose the government are caught in a bind of a different kind on which I don't want to comment today.
Yes.
And those who cannot fight have no wherewithal to fight. So now it's left to the people. If the main opposition party chooses not to fight and continues in the fashion that it does, then we land ourselves in the situation that we've landed ourselves in.
You touched on media, freedom of speech and expression, and monopolization of mainstream media, or attempts to do that. I think it's still quite diverse, but this tendency is clear. So after the emergency, when there was total suppression, censorship, and so on, this seems to be the worst situation so far as free speech and freedom of the media are concerned. Apart from the killings of journalists,
Yes.
this is often not publicized.
Yes.
But India has been, the Committee to Protect Journalists has focused on India as, you can say, as a founding and permanent member of this club of shame, where journalists are killed in connection with, usually journalists who are vulnerable, freelance and so on, but also others are killed. But worse than that is that they seem to have, the impunity index. The global impunity index includes India as one of the dozen countries or so which are permanent members of this. The case doesn't come to any final result. Justice is not rendered in any one of these cases. That's been tracked meticulously by the Committee to Protect Journalists. So would you agree that after the emergency, this is perhaps the most...
No, it's worse than the emergency, if you ask me.
How so?
Because it's captured. That time there were voices that were heard in court.
Yes.
It was not fully captured. Institutions were not captured. This is now, everything is captured. And captured in a very insidious way. And it's very difficult to dismantle it. Because the stakes are too high.
Whenever freedom of speech or other fundamental rights come into question, are assaulted or allegedly assaulted, when you go to courts, you hear this cry of national security interests. Yeah. Courts seem to be very reluctant to enter into this domain. There are many cases that raise very disturbing questions about what's behind these decisions.
No, I think that it's in Hindi we call it a hawa. National security is just an expression to fob the issue, basically.
Oh.
You see, the question is, I've always been saying this, many of these terms cannot be defined. How do you define equality? Can you ever define equality? You cannot. How do you define freedom? Can you define freedom? You cannot. It's all contextual. And therefore national security, has hijab anything to do with national security?
Yes.
Nothing to do with national security. But as you know, freedom of expression can only be curtailed on grounds of national security. How do you, so these are all issues that, you see, that's why if courts are silent on these issues, take sedition law.
Yes.
Can an 80-year-old man who's being prosecuted in the Bhima Koregaon case be a threat to national security? Can Navlakha be a threat to national security? Or Stan Smith, was he a threat to national security? Or Sudha Bhardwaj, for that matter? How can these people be threats to national security, but they're in jail? Now, if the courts don't do anything about it, what can we do? This is the problem.
So, thank you very much for this insightful and enlightening lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Give a good applause for this, sir. Now we are coming to the close of the session. I request Dr. Napini Charan to thank the audience.
With tribute to Rakesh, on behalf of Mr. N.R. Elango and the family, I thank our respectable Honorable Chief Minister for unveiling the portrait of our jubilant dear Rakesh. We thank Roja Muthiah Research Library for hosting this event today and the same every year. Thank you, Mr. Sundar. I wish to place on record my special thanks to a respected member of the Parliament, Shri Kapil Sibal, for the towering personality and the excellent delivery of the lecture. Sir, I promise I stand up and I will talk, yet be cautiously brave. Thank you. And Mr. Ram for moderating this excellent lecture. More so than moderating, the questions shooted by you made us think more. Before he could answer, it made us think more to wait to see what he will answer. So 2 towering personalities at a row was a great splendor. I thank Justice Rajilagu for sharing his experience with Rakesh. I think we've all been there with him. Whatever he shared was absolute truth. I thank the galaxy of legal dignitaries for gracing this occasion. When we lost Rakesh, Phoenix பறவை போல் எங்களை எழச் செய்தவர் நம் தலைவர் முதல்வர் அவர்கள். எப்படி ஒரு கற்பூரம், as it states, from the solid state moves to the gaseous state, Mr. Elango and his family have moved on from the grief to the state of acceptance and action. You have the people who've helped us to move to this. எங்களை இந்த நிலைக்கு எழச் செய்த உங்கள் அனைவரையும் கைகூப்பி வணங்குகிறேன். மரணம் என்பது தூக்கம், பிறப்பு என்பது விழிப்பு. மார்ச் 10ஆம் தேதி உடலால் மரணித்த எங்கள் அன்பு ராகேஷ் இன்று அறக்கட்டளையாய், சிந்தனையாய், செயலாய் மீண்டும் பிறந்துள்ளார் என்பதில் ஐயமில்லை. Finally, I thank the organizing team, the staff of Kalaivanar Arangam, and each and every one of you to make this event happen. Mr. Elango, we will celebrate every day. வாழ்க ஓங்குக ராகேஷ் புகழ். நன்றி.
Thank you.